Do you want me to wait a couple of minutes or are we good to start?
You're good to start if you're ready.
Okay, I'll get started. Okay. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Fatima, and I'll be conducting this What They Don't Tell You About Tech Interviews workshop today. First up, can everyone see me, hear me okay, and see my screen as well? You could just react with like a thumbs up. Perfect. Okay. So we'll get started. So I'll start off with a little bit about myself. I'm a software engineer at Yelp. I joined Yelp last October, so it's been fairly recent. And that was actually the motivation behind this workshop because as I was going through the technical interviews myself, I felt that there's a lot about technical interviews that I think we don't talk about. Obviously, like everyone talks about like the knowledge that you should bring in, right? And while there's oh, is it? Hold on, I'll just take my headphones off. Give me a second. No? Hello? Is it still echoing or is it better? Oh, okay, perfect. Okay, yeah. So as I was saying, I feel that there's a lot of discussion as far as like the technical knowledge that you should bring into your technical interviews. But as I was going through the interviews myself, I feel that there's a lot of other factors that really make a difference. So that's what I hope to shed some light on today. I know that given this hackathon, a lot of you might just be like high school students or whatnot. So you might feel that like it's a bit like it's too early for you to attend a workshop like this or whatnot. But that's actually not true because when I was in my undergrad, just learning about this process, honestly, it can be quite overwhelming because tech interviews are pretty they're done like typically they're done a bit differently. They can take a very long time. So I think just learning about the process is kind of like half the battle. So you're at the right place. But yeah, so before we move on, just a disclaimer that I'm in no way, shape, or form representing Yelp here, and any opinions or views that are expressed in this workshop, they're held exclusively by myself. So this is what this workshop is going to look like. We're going to go very chronologically. At any point, if you have any questions, please type them up in the chat. I'll get to them once I finish going through all of the content. At the end, you can also unmute yourself and ask me any questions that you have. But yeah, so we're going to go very chronologically. I'm going to give you a very end-to-end overview of the whole process. So starting from like the very beginning, when you're applying to jobs, all the way to the very end when you're talking about things like deciding between multiple offers and negotiating your compensation and whatnot. So to get things started, in the pre-interview stage, what I wanted to talk about was just how the pandemic has just changed the recruiting landscape and how you go about navigating that now. So I know that like obviously in the pre-pandemic world, obviously as all of our interactions were in person, that also included interactions with our recruiters, right? So what that typically looked like was that you would meet recruiters through either like hackathons or conferences or tech fairs or whatever it was, or they would come to your university campuses and conduct information sessions and whatnot. However, since that is no longer the case, how do you go about networking in this virtual world that we live in now? And to get that started, I wanted to first quickly talk about your elevator pitch, which is basically this brief introduction that you prepare for yourself. And as the name implies, it should be effective enough to catch someone's attention in the same amount of time as an elevator ride. Now, a couple of tips for your elevator pitch. First of all, please be genuine. I think that if you're genuine, your enthusiasm and passion will really show. And I also say this because, like, keep in mind that recruiters deal with a lot of people on a daily basis. So they're pretty good at figuring out if someone isn't being completely honest about either their past experiences or their skill set. Secondly, express genuine interest in the company. Now, I honestly think that this can take you really, really far, because you'd be surprised to know, like, I personally interviewed a lot of candidates, and you'd be surprised to know the number of candidates that come into interviews not knowing at all what the company does, or why, obviously. And obviously, if you don't know what the company does, then you're not going to be able to answer why you want to work for this particular company, right? So really take out the time to think about why you want to work for them. Is it, is it the engineering culture? Is it the product that really excites you? Is it the culture of, like, innovation or mentorship or whatever it is? I really urge you to think about this question very early on in the process, because not only is this like a very common question that you can expect to be asked, your recruiter is for sure going to ask you this question, and even in later parts of your interview, this question might show up. So it's always better if you do this research early on in the process as opposed to later on. I can tell you personally how I like to answer this question. So in my response to this question, I usually talk about, like, it's like a three-part response. So in the first part of my response, I talk about, like, just the technical appeal of the company, right? So assuming that I'm applying to a software engineering posting, what is like, how is that company going to help me improve myself, like, just from, like, a technical perspective, if I were to join them. In the second part of my response, I talk about the cultural appeal. So what is it? Is there really something that I like about the company culture that I want to be a part of? And in the third part of my response, I talk about, like, particular initiatives that the company has taken that I really like. I think, like, this, so I do think that, like, this third part is kind of optional, but like, if you do it well, I think that it can really show just the level and the depth of your interest in a given company, right? Because obviously it shows the recruiter, or your interviewer, that, like, you're actually really, like, you really keep up with this company, you really follow them. So for example, when I was interviewing with Yelp, for the third part of my response, I said that I really liked how Yelp, responded to small businesses when the pandemic hit, just to kind of give you an example. Okay, so moving on. So another thing that I wanted to talk about was just how you should tailor your approach based on the person it is that you're reaching out to. Now, obviously, there's different types of people that you will reach out to in your job hunt, right? There's obviously you're going to be reaching out to recruiters, but then you're also going to be reaching out to people within your network. So this can include friends, former colleagues, people that you went to school with. So I do think that with respect to, like, these different categories of people that you're reaching out to, your approach should be a bit different. So this two screenshots that you see here, these are basically personal messages that I sent out in my most recent job hunt. So I'll start with the message on the left. Now, that is just a message that I sent to a recruiter on LinkedIn. And, basically what I wanted to demonstrate through these screenshots is that, like, as far as a recruiter is concerned, I think that it's perfectly okay for you to be very, like, to the point, and very, like, get straight to the point. Don't beat around the bush. Don't waste their time, because obviously a lot of candidates reach out to them on, like, a daily basis. So don't waste their time, be respectful of it, and get straight to the point. But however, I do always tell people that when you're reaching out to recruiters, please make sure that your message to them, or, like, if you're sending them an email, it's very well structured. So what I always like to advise people is introduce yourself. Then quickly mention the exact posting or opening that you're interested in. If you can include a link to it, that's even better. Then quickly talk about why you think you would be a good fit for that opening. Like, what is your skill set? How does it relate to that specific job posting in particular? And then lastly, always include your resume for future reference. So I think that's, like, a good enough way to approach a recruiter. So coming to the screenshot on the right, I do think that as far as people within your network are concerned, so these can include, like, like I said, friends, former colleagues, people that you went to school with. I do think that your approach should be a bit different, because ultimately you share a different relationship with these people. So you don't want to make the conversation sound too transactional, and you don't want to make them feel like you're just using them as a means to an end. So a good way to do that is to, when you're reaching out to someone, never mention the referral in the first kind of message that you send them. The first thing that you should do is just to reach out to them and ask them if they would be okay grabbing like a virtual kind of coffee chat with you, right? Like in the first couple of conversations, you should just show the person that you're interested in learning more about them. You're interested in learning more about what their company does, what their day-to-day kind of looks like, what is their job, what parts of their job do they like, what parts of their job do they dislike. Just try to have like a very natural, organic kind of a conversation with them. And then slowly you can kind of direct that conversation into, you asking them if they'd be okay referring you for a particular position. But yeah, I will say that please, if you're just reaching out to people within your network, never start the conversation off by mentioning that, hey, would it be okay if you referred me for this given position? Okay, moving on. Another very popular question that I tend to get is just how many jobs you should be applying to. Sadly, there's no magical number to that, but I do have a couple of tips as far as that is concerned. So first of all, I would say that really harness the power of platforms like LinkedIn, Glassdoor, etc. I've personally used both these platforms very successfully. I got an internship off of Glassdoor, and then I got my most recent job off of LinkedIn. So I can personally attest to how useful these platforms are. In my most recent job hunt, I just stuck to LinkedIn, honestly, because there's a lot of overlap that you see between LinkedIn and Glassdoor. So I think that you'd be perfectly okay just sticking to either one of them. I personally really prefer LinkedIn. Then secondly, in terms of just the process of applying to jobs, first of all, let me kind of break it to you that is an incredibly boring process. It's not fun. It's very monotonous. It's very repetitive, because all it is that, you're filling out the same fields over and over again. You're uploading your resume repeatedly. So it can get very overwhelming very quickly. So just in terms of that process, I've kind of experimented with both ends of the spectrum in the sense that I've been the person who used to sit down every Sunday and, go through thousands and thousands of postings and then kind of apply to jobs in bulk. But I think that way of going about it it's very inefficient, because obviously when you're going through, so many postings, you're not going to go through them within like an hour. It's going to be a greater time commitment than that. And yeah, it's just not efficient. It gets very boring. Like I said, very overwhelming. So to make it kind of more manageable, what I did recently was that I incorporated this into like a part of like my daily routine. So every day I would set aside anywhere between 30 to 45 minutes. And, I would apply like on any of these platforms that you use. They always have filters that filter out like jobs that were posted within like the last week or last 24 hours or last whatever, last 1 month. I would apply the filter that would for the last 24 hours. Obviously that list isn't going to be as long. I would quickly go through the jobs and I'd apply to the ones that I was interested in. I think this way of going about it is definitely a lot more manageable. I also think that, this way you won't miss out on any good jobs, because you're doing this every single day, right? I think that just in terms of better use of your time, this is a much better way of going about it, because you know that, okay, every day 30 to 45 minutes of my day is going to be spent doing this. Beyond that, I'm going to pull the plug on it. I'm not going to spend any more time on just applying to jobs than this. So I think it makes it a lot more manageable, and I think it definitely takes the pressure off of you as well, because I know that for so many of my friends, as far as searching for a job was concerned, this was the part that they used to dread the most, like the part where you actually have to search for jobs and apply to them. That was the part that they would dread the most. So once you kind of make it a part of your daily routine, it just takes the pressure off of the whole thing. Okay, so now we're going to move on to talking about the actual interview stage. And to get that conversation started, I'm going to first give you an overview of basically how tech interviews happen, at least for kind of, quote unquote, big tech companies. Obviously, these can look a lot different based on, like, if you're interviewing with like a smaller or medium size or like a startup. But, you'll see common elements in all of them. So it usually starts off with a recruiter reaching out to you with either a phone screen or an online coding challenge. You can also get a take-home assignment in some cases. Now, take-home assignments I found are truer for smaller companies or startups. Like bigger companies usually like to stick to either like a phone screen or an online coding challenge. But you should be aware that you could also see a take-home assignment. I am personally not a fan of take-home assignments. I think the amount of effort that you put into them is absolutely not worth what you get out of it. But I mean, you at least you know now. Then, depending on the outcome of this first round, there can be a small behavioral round following this. This is usually conducted with an engineering manager, and the purpose of this is to assess just a cultural fit. And then, lastly, you make it onto your on-site. Now, the on-site in the pre-pandemic world was the part where the company would fly you out to their headquarters, and you would basically spend the entire day in interviews. However, in the virtual world that we live in now, this is also conducted virtually. This is a standard anywhere between 4 to 5 hours. It varies a lot by company. It's a combination of technical, behavioral, and system design rounds. There can be anywhere between 2 to 3 technical rounds, 1 system design, and 1 to 2 behavioral rounds. Now, like I said, this varies a lot by company. So I'll give you a couple of examples of just different interview formats that I've seen. So when I was interviewing with Amazon, my on-site was 5 hours. There were 5 rounds. Each round was 45 minutes. The first 15 to 20 minutes of each round were kept for behavioral questions, and then the rest of the time was spent on your technical questions. But I've also interviewed with companies where they've had like dedicated rounds that were either behavioral or technical. So like I said, you can see a lot of variation here. Another thing that I wanted to mention as far as your on-sites are concerned is that not every company might do this, but some companies might offer you some sort of like an accommodation for your final on-site. So for example, when I was interviewing with Twitter, they gave me the option to split my on-site across 2 days. Like I could either do it in 1 day, so finish the interview in 1 day, or I could split it across 2 days. But like I said, not every company might do this, but like at the very least, if you have concerns about your on-site, if you're feeling too overwhelmed, if you feel that the pressure would be too much, or you won't perform well, this is always something that you can ask your recruiter. Then moving up to your on-site, your recruiter is basically your point of contact. They'll inform you of the logistics of what your on-site will look like. So they'll inform you of the structure of the different interviews, the duration, the names of the interviewers, etc. And they'll also most likely set up a chat with you to give you an opportunity to ask questions. And I highly, highly advise you to really use this opportunity to ask them anything that will put you at ease during the interview. So for example, how will the technical rounds be conducted? Are you expected to write production level code, or is pseudocode okay? Will they be using HackerRank or CoderPad, or can you use like an IDE of your choice? You can even ask them when you can expect to hear back after the interview. For the system design rounds, you can ask them how will those be conducted? So, can you write things down on your own notepad and hold it up for the interviewer to see? Or can you use like a virtual whiteboard? And then lastly, you can even ask them like what level you're being considered for. So the reason why I include this last question is because a lot of the times for software engineering postings online, you'll see that they don't really specify the level that you're being considered for. And the reason why this happens is because companies typically have openings across a wide variety of engineering levels. So they'll put out this generic looking posting, which doesn't mention any level or whatnot. And then based on the candidate pool and, the results of their on-site, they assign the level that they think is most well suited to a given candidate. So for example, when I was interviewing with Twitter, I was being considered for both the new grad and the level 2 engineering role. And again, that was contingent on how I did in my final on-site. Okay, so before we get to kind of like the meat and bones of this workshop, I just want to make it super clear that, the purpose of this workshop is not to tell you that, hey, you don't need to like study for your technical interviews and, I'm just come attend my workshop and I'm going to give you the magical beans that will allow you to ace all your interviews. Absolutely not. Like I said before, the knowledge that you bring into your technical interviews, it forms the foundation of your basically your performance in a technical interview, right? However, I do think that there's other factors at play, and so that's what basically I'm going to share with you. And I like, in my opinion, just like the tips and tricks that I'm going to share with you, they'll not only complement the basic interview preparation that I'm assuming that you've done or you will do, but they'll also help you set yourself apart as a candidate. So to get started, we're going to first talk about behavioral interviews. Now, I've had like I actually have like a very interesting kind of background with behavioral interviews, in the sense that for the longest time I used to really underestimate behavioral interviews, in the sense that I used to think that, oh, like a behavioral interview is just like a conversation between yourself and your interviewer, so like how bad can it really be, and like, a conversation should flow fairly naturally, so why should I set aside some time to prepare for my behavioral rounds? I'd rather spend that time and energy focusing on my technical rounds. But let me tell you that that's like a very kind of misguided way of going about it, because your behavioral rounds are as important as your technical rounds. They're not filler rounds, they're there for a purpose. So this list that you see on screen, these are roughly kind of like these are very typical questions that you can expect to see in a behavioral interview. In terms of kind of interesting questions that I've seen, I think that it would definitely be like the last one. So like, how would you improve company X's product? So this is actually a pro tip. So if you're ever interviewing with a company that has, let's say, like an app, right? So for example, you're interviewing with Facebook or Uber or whatnot, make sure that you actually use the app before you go into an interview with them, because this is definitely a question that they can ask you, that like, if you've used our app, do you have any constructive criticism about it? But yeah, so these are like fairly typical questions. But again, these are all questions that you should be very well prepared for. And secondly, you could also these are like, you could also get something that's not on this list. So usually how I like to prepare for behavioral interviews is that I'll go to Glassdoor, or I'll go to like different discussion forums or whatnot, and I'll search for different behavioral questions that the company has historically asked their candidates, just to get some idea of what I can be expected to answer. Then in terms of just your responses for behavioral questions, I do have a couple of tips. First of all, please be honest. Don't fabricate experiences, because you will most likely be caught. It's okay to do minor modifications here and there, but please don't share something that's completely fictitious. And the reason why I say that is because interviewers always ask follow-up questions. So let's say that you're sharing something with the interviewer that you just came up with on the spot. It's completely fictitious. Now, what's going to happen is that the interviewer is going to pick at like specific elements from what you just shared, and they're going to ask you about it. So in this follow-up kind of cross-examination that happens, if you're unable to kind of answer their questions adequately, then they're going to figure out that you either weren't being completely honest, or you just weren't well prepared to answer this question. So I think for behavioral questions, it's always better just to be honest. Secondly, be a good storyteller. And one of the best ways to do that is to use the STAR format. I haven't included an explanation for this format, but this is a very, very widely used format that you should definitely search up on your own time. In fact, before my on-site with Amazon, they actually sent me like a handout where they specifically mentioned that they really like it if their candidates use the STAR format to structure their responses to behavioral questions. Then for each category that I showed you on the previous slide, I would always advise you to prepare like more than one scenario, like have more than one scenario in mind. So for example, in your interviews, it's very common for people to ask you to share times where you failed or where you've experienced like a setback. Always prepare, like always have more than one experience that you can talk about, just because a lot of the times you might see these questions being repeated. So just to kind of avoid sounding too repetitive in your responses, it's always better if you come into your interviews having thought of like multiple scenarios or multiple experiences that you can talk about. Next, show what you've learned from your experiences, even if they were failures. Now, the reason why I mentioned this is because I know that for a lot of people, when they're asked about like a failure or like, if you're asked to share a weakness of yours, that kind of a question really scares them because a lot of people might think that these are kind of trick questions, right? I can assure you that they're not. And please don't ever think that the right response to if you're asked to share a weakness of yours is that you work too hard, because that's genuinely not the right response. But yeah, so as far as like questions about concerning failures or your weaknesses are concerned, the whole point of those questions is that the interviewer wants to see whether you're the kind of person who does some self-reflection, right? Like they want to see that, okay, are you someone who actually sits down and reflects back on their experiences? So if you're ever asked about a failure that you experienced, here's how you're going to answer that question. You're going to first obviously talk about that experience. Then you're going to talk about what you learned from that experience. And lastly, you're going to talk about how you changed your ways moving forward from that experience. Because if you incorporate these three different elements into your response, you show the interviewer that you've come full circle, right? And this is how you come full circle. You experienced something, you learned something from it, and then you changed your ways kind of moving forward. So always keep those three distinct elements in mind whenever you're talking about like a failure or a setback that you've experienced or like a weakness of yours. Lastly, if you're asked a question that you don't have an answer to right away, you can ask your interviewer if you can have 1 to 2 minutes to think about it. I personally wasn't aware that you could do this, but I have done this and this is perfectly okay. However, I will say that please keep in mind that interview rounds are anywhere between 45 minutes to an hour. So obviously you can't be thinking about a question for 5 to 10 minutes. Even if you are, your interviewer will just move you on to the next question. However, if you do need a couple of seconds or like, 1 to 2 minutes to think about a question and, just structure it in your head, it's perfectly okay for you to take that time. Okay, so moving on to your technical rounds. Like I said, I'm not going to talk about the what data structures you should know or what algorithms you should know for your interviews. What I'm going to talk about is the optimal strategy that you should have for your technical interviews, because you might not believe this, your success in a technical interview isn't just about the knowledge that you bring in. They're actively looking out for like the overall kind of strategy that you used in your technical interview. So that's the strategy that I'm going to talk about. So first of all, please keep in mind that questions are kept purposefully vague, and it's your job to clarify, because a big part of these interviews is that they're assessing your abilities as a software engineer that go just beyond writing code, right? Because that's not all a software engineer does. There's a lot of other components to your job as well. So, one of those big kind of components is the ability to do requirements gathering, right? And what that means is that asking good, meaningful, insightful questions. How do you deal with vague specifications? How do you clarify assumptions? Things like that. So it's very important for you to keep in mind that questions, they give you a vague question on purpose because they want to see, okay, how will you as a software engineer go about addressing this question? So how are you going to figure out the exact specifications that are needed for you to properly address this question? Ask, like I already mentioned this, ask questions. Don't jump into the question not having clarified any assumptions. I've interviewed so many people who, you give them a problem, they're not going to take their time to properly read the question prompt. They're not going to ask you any questions. They're just going to jump straight into the coding part of the problem, and that is an absolute no. You cannot do that. Do not ever jump straight into writing out the code, because that for sure is not going to reflect positively on you. Um, then write down test cases, specifically corner or edge cases. I know that as software engineers, we tend to have a tendency to not think about testing, or we don't value testing as much as we should, which is ironic because obviously you can't write good software if it hasn't been tested well. um, but specifically within technical interviews, you need to think about testing very early on. Don't leave it off as something that you're going to deal with in like the last 5 to 10 minutes of your interview, because I assure you, you're not going to have that kind of time at the end. So write down test cases, identify your corner or edge cases very, very early on in the beginning, because you're going to be referring back to them in towards the end as well. Then something extremely important for your technical interviews: communicate effectively, talk things out loud, discuss trade-offs, different strategies that you're considering, etc. Again, I know that for a lot of people, they might think that your success in a technical interview is all about whether or not you could get to the right solution. I can assure you that it is not. Obviously, that's a big part of it, right? Because your interviewer, they want to hire someone who got as close to the optimal solution as possible. However, like I said before, they're more interested in your strategy. I can personally tell you that I've been in so many interviews where I didn't get to the 100% kind of optimal solution. I was maybe like 60 to 80% there. But just because I communicated my process very well, the interviewer knew what kind of direction I was headed into. They knew the different trade offs that I was considering, the different strategies that I was considering. Just because of that, just because of how well I was communicating, not only did I pass those interview rounds, but I also got very great feedback from those interview rounds as well. So just something for you to keep in mind. Again, if you're stuck, you can ask for help, but I'll say that there's like a caveat to this. Like, you can't ask for help if you've just been quiet for the last 30 minutes. And after 30 minutes, you go up to your interviewer and you're like, hey, I need help. That's not going to work. You can ask for help provided that you've been communicating well up to that point. And I think one of the other benefits of effective communication is that just because the interviewer is going to know what kind of like direction you're headed into, you won't even actually have to kind of ask for help, because like if the interviewer, because they're constantly listening to you, so if they feel that you're going in like the wrong direction, they'll actually like stop you and nudge you towards the right direction. So again, I think that's one of the other great benefits of effective communication, is that it's a lot better for you in terms of just your time, right? You end up saving a lot of time, and time is of the essence in a technical interview. For your system design rounds, it's very important to draw diagrams or class diagrams if the question is about object-oriented design. And this is because they want to see your understanding of how different components in the system are interconnected. Um, then not every interviewer will allow you to compile your code and see if the test cases pass. This is something that is very, very important for you to keep in mind, because I know that when we're practicing on our own time, so let's say you're working on like a very challenging lead code problem. I'm sure that we've all been in a scenario where when you're working on a very difficult problem, you're almost there but you still haven't cracked like the right solution. So you have a couple of test cases that are failing. So what you do is that you make a little change and you hit the run button again, and you still have a couple of test cases that are failing. So you get into this loop of like making a change, hitting the run button, making a change, hitting the run button, until eventually you either give up or you'll get to the right solution, right? You cannot, under any circumstances, do this within a technical interview. I call this the abuse of the run button. And this basically tells your interviewer two things about you. One, it tells them that you do not have the debugging ability to actually figure out what the problem with your logic is. And secondly, it tells them that you rely on automated testing to tell you what the problem with your logic is. And you don't want your interviewer to be thinking either of those two things about you. So in terms of just the optimal strategy that we were talking about, what you're going to do is that for the let's start off from the very beginning. When you get the question, you're going to take your time to read the question. You're going to ask you're going to ask the interviewer follow-up questions. You're going to deal with any vague specifications in the question. You're going to clarify any assumptions. Next, you're going to identify corner or edge cases, and you're going to write those test cases down and quickly work with your interviewer to see what the expected test outcomes should be for those test cases. Only now should you start working on the actual logic. Once you're done with the coding part, before you hit any sort of submit button, you're going to do this exercise where, using the code that you've just written, you're going to refer back to the test cases that you wrote out earlier, and you're going to step through your code to see if they work as expected. Okay, is your logic working as expected? Are you getting the right test outcomes? Only once you've done this exercise will you hit any run button or any submit button or whatnot, because you need to show your interviewer a couple of things through this exercise. One, it shows them that you actually have the ability to step through your code, because that is a skill in itself. Not everyone can do that. And then secondly, it tells them that you have reasonable assurance that your logic is going to work as expected. So something very, very important to just keep in mind. Lastly, if you're very nervous about your technical rounds, I would advise you to watch real life technical interview videos on YouTube. Now, I did this. This was something that I did because I was extremely nervous about my technical interviews. I will say though that I think that there's like a couple of reasons behind it. I think one, at this point, technical interviews have this reputation within the tech industry of being very scary and very intimidating and very overwhelming. And I think right now you might not have been exposed to that reputation that they have. But I think as you move, as you get to like your undergrad and whatnot, as you get closer and closer to graduating, you'll start being exposed to this reputation that I'm talking about. And then secondly, I think that as far as technical interviews are concerned, I think that as candidates, we tend to have this expectation from ourselves of like perfection. And we go into these interviews thinking that we cannot afford to be anything less than perfect, which could not be further from the truth. Like, no one expects you to be perfect in a technical interview, or any interview for that matter, right? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, an interview is an interaction between two human beings. So there's bound to be issues. There's bound to be like little errors that you make here and there, and that's perfectly okay. That's very natural. But I do think that, once I started seeing people, how actual people kind of interact or how they act or behave in like actual real life situations where they're in interviews, it just put me at ease, because I think it just kind of humanized this process for me, right? So like, you realize that, oh, a lot of people stutter when they're nervous. I do that. Then you realize that it's okay to ask for help. You realize that it's okay to be stuck. It's okay not to have the right answer right away. So yeah, I would highly advise you to kind of do the same if that's how you're feeling as well. Okay, so this is the last and final part of my presentation. So in the post-interview stage, I'm going to first talk about how hiring committees work, because I think that as candidates, we really tend to lack an understanding of what happens behind the scenes once we're done our interviews, right? So basically what happens is that once you're done, you're on site, your recruiter puts together this package for you that includes a couple of things. It includes your resume, it includes feedback from all the interviewers that met you during your interviews, and it also include any coding samples that you've submitted so far in the process. Now, all of this package is then sent over to the hiring committee, which makes the final decisions as to whether or not an offer is going to be extended to a candidate or not. Now, the frequency at which hiring committees meet, it can be very different based on the company. So for some companies, hiring committees meet as often as 3 times a week. So with those companies, the turnaround time is going to be very quick. You're likely going to hear back about the results of your interview within like 1 to 2 days. But like I said, this can be very different based on the company it is that you're interviewing with. So that's why there might be some gap between when you finish your interviews and then when you actually hear back from your recruiter about whether or not you're going to be getting an offer. Now this, I've given you like a very high level overview of hiring committees. You can definitely look this up on your own time. It's a very fascinating read. Google, for example, is very famous for how their hiring committees work. So definitely something that you should look into if you're intrigued. Then I also quickly wanted to just walk through a couple of scenarios that can happen after your interview. So, for example, if you're rejected, obviously that's not what any candidate wants, but I do think that there's a professional way of going about it. There's a professional way of handling your rejections as well. Please don't be that person that just reads the rejection email and then, off to the junk folder. At the very least, thank your recruiter, because you have to realize that your recruiter is really someone who's with you through every step of the process. They're with you from like the very start all the way to the very end. Just like you've invested a lot of time and energy into the company, they've also invested a lot of time and energy in you. So thank your recruiter. And if company policy allows, you can ask the company for feedback. Now, bigger companies actually have explicit policies against giving feedback, but like for smaller companies, they're usually okay. They don't have a problem. I personally asked two of the companies that I interviewed with for feedback, and they were very gracious enough to share it with me. And honestly, that feedback is invaluable, right? Like that's the best opportunity for you to actually know what your performance was in an interview. So just something to keep in mind. In case you accept the offer, that's perfect, you're done. Still thank your recruiter. But please be mindful of other companies that you might have interviews scheduled with. Please don't ghost anyone, be respectful of their time, and let them know respectfully of your decision. In case you reject the offer, you still have to thank your recruiter. And basically in all scenarios, I think that it's always better never to shut the door completely on a particular company unless you saw some like explicit red flags in your interviews with them. I think it's always better to propose staying connected for future opportunities, because this way, not only does your network continue to grow, but the next time that you're in the job market, you'll have some solid places to kind of start from. And just to kind of demonstrate this post-interview etiquette that I was talking about, this is an email that I sent out to a company that I was no longer interested in interviewing with because I had already accepted an offer. So like I said, I thank them for their time. I tell them that I had a wonderful time meeting all of their engineers in my interviews with them, and that, I would love to stay connected for future opportunities. Okay, so this is like, as far as I know, for a lot of people, like obviously at this, when you're at like the high school, or like, when you're a freshman in university or whatnot, this is part of the process that you don't really have a lot of kind of awareness about. So I think it's so beneficial to you that, you're kind of hearing me talk about this, because you're going to be so ahead of the curve. There's so many people who are not even aware of the fact that you can actually negotiate the offers that you get. So yeah, this is something that I really like talking about, again, for the reason that I just said, because there's a huge lack of awareness about this. And even for people who are aware that you can negotiate your offer, there's a lot of awkwardness about this part of the process as well. Like I know personally for myself and for a lot of like my friends as well, for some reason, people feel very awkward when they get to this stage. Like people feel awkward going up to a recruiter and being like, oh no, I'm not happy with what you're giving me. I want more. So that's why I wanted to talk about this. And to start off, I'll give you a quick overview of what typical compensation packages in tech are like, because they can have a lot more components than what we're usually used to. So like I know typically people have like a base salary, and then you'll have like a yearly bonus, right? But tech compensation packages can have more components to them. So to start off, there's a base salary. Again, like I mentioned, we're all familiar with this, and this is usually the most difficult to negotiate. Then there's your restricted stock units, or your RSUs. Now, this is basically company stock, okay? So what you need to understand with your RSUs is that they need to vest for them to have actual monetary value for you. So you need to understand the vesting schedule. So for example, let's say that tomorrow you sign a contract, you get an offer from a company, and they give you 100K worth of RSUs, okay? Now, at the time that you've signed the contract, though that 100K worth of RSUs hold zero monetary value for you because they have not vested yet. typically in companies follow a 4-year vesting schedule. So roughly with a 4-year vesting schedule, each year 25% of your RSUs will vest. So what that means is that after you worked at this company for 1 year, 25% of that 100K that was granted to you, it will vest. And at this point, it holds monetary value for you. So at this point, after it's vested, that 25% has vested, it's just company stock. So you can either choose to sell it, or you can choose to keep it, or do whatever you want with it. That's completely up to you. But yeah, that's how restricted stock units work. And you like I said, you really need to understand the vesting schedule to understand them. So the reason why I mentioned this is because when you sign offers, they grant you an X K worth of, X dollars worth of RSUs. So, and the number usually might be very big. Like I said, you could get 100K worth of RSUs. So don't start jumping in like excitement that, oh, I'm going to be getting 100K this year. That's not true. You have to understand the vesting schedule. And typically each year you're going to be getting 25% of what was granted to you in your initial contract. Okay, moving on. Then there's a yearly bonus. I think these are pretty standard as well. This is a set percentage of your base salary. Again, what that set percentage is can look very different based on the company. So I know that for a lot of trading firms, for example, I used to formerly work at a trading firm. Their yearly bonuses are huge. They can be anywhere between 10 to 15% of your base salary. But again, like I said, this can look very different based on the company. So in other companies, your yearly bonus might just be like maybe anywhere between 2 to 5% of your base salary. So it can look very different based on the company. This is prorated. So what that means is that if you worked for the company for 6 months, your yearly bonus will be half of what it would have been if you had worked there the entire year. Lastly, there's a signing bonus, and this is usually where you have the most room to negotiate. Now, keep in mind that the signing bonus is a one-time thing. You only get it when you basically only get it in your first year when you sign the contract, right? So I always tell people to be mindful of to be able to make this distinction, because if you're calculating what you're going to be making yearly after the first year, it's just going to be your base salary, the RSUs that vest that year, and it's going to be your yearly bonus. So be careful of making that distinction. Then as far as just research about compensation numbers go, obviously you can talk to your friends if they're comfortable sharing their packages. And I always think that it's better to talk to people across like a wide variety of industries who are working in the same role as you, because it just gives you a much better idea of what to expect. So for example, go talk to someone who's working as a software developer at say like a bank versus like a big tech company versus like say a hedge fund. I think it just gives you a much better idea of what the market might be willing to kind of offer you. In terms of resources online, I actually would not recommend Glassdoor because it can be a bit unreliable. I would recommend something like levels.fyi. I would highly recommend this resource. I've personally used it. It's usually very, very accurate. And for a couple of other reasons. One, it breaks down the salary packages for you into these different components that we just talked about. Then it also shows you how salaries differ based on location. So keep in mind that you could be working for the exact same company in the exact same team, but you could be making something very different if you're say based in San Francisco versus Toronto versus say London. So Levels offers you that sort of a transparency as well. And then lastly, it also shows you how salaries differ across like a wide variety of engineering levels. So overall, a highly recommended resource. Then as far as like the negotiation conversation is concerned, please never accept an offer as soon as it's presented. Your recruiter will likely call you to discuss the compensation package. And at this time, you should just jot down the details, thank them, and ask them for how long you have to accept the offer. And the reason why I say this is because a lot of offers in tech are called exploding offers. And that's because you usually don't have a lot of time to accept the offer, usually like a week or maybe 10 days. So it's always better to have that rough timeline in mind. Then just in terms of how to go about having the negotiation conversation, I got a lot of advice. Like some people told me that, oh, you should just call your recruiter and kind of get it over with. Or, if you're if you're not comfortable with that, you can email them. I think ultimately, obviously, it depends on your own personal preference. It depends on what you're most comfortable with. But I will say that, like, keep in mind that recruiters are fairly persuasive people. Again, like, no fault of their own. That's a big part of their job. So if you feel that, you won't be able to kind of stand your ground over a phone call, don't call them, email them instead. That's what I did, because I was strongly of the opinion that if I were to call my recruiter, they would get me to agree on the initial numbers that the company was putting forward. So just something to kind of keep in mind. In your follow-up conversation, always thank them for extending the offer to you. And at this point, you should have concrete numbers ready and mention any competing offers or deadlines. However, please never lie to a recruiter about competing offers or compensation. Don't make up something like, oh, I've also, like, let's say if you're interviewing with company XYZ, don't tell them that, oh, Google and Facebook are also after me and they're giving me like this much compensation. Don't do that, because not only are recruiters very well connected, they can also ask you to submit proof of competing offers or compensation. So at this point, I usually get two questions. One, a lot of people ask me if it's okay for you to negotiate for your internships, and it absolutely is. There's no rule anywhere that says that you can only negotiate for your full-time offers. You should negotiate even for your internships. I've personally helped my younger brother negotiate for 2 of his internships very successfully. Secondly, people ask me if they should try to negotiate even if you don't have any competing offers. And to that, I also say you absolutely should try. Now, the reason why I say yes to both those questions is because keep in mind that negotiation at the end of the day is a skill. It's not something that you're magically going to know how to do just by the time you get to your full-time offers. So it's very important that you start honing the skill as early as you can. So I think that if you start trying to negotiate at the internship level, hopefully by the time you get to your full-time offers, you'll have a much better idea of how to just have this conversation, how to navigate this conversation, how to get your point across. Lastly, recruiters really like it if you convey that you'll be ready to sign the contract immediately if they can get to your proposed numbers. And just to kind of demonstrate this is the email that I sent out to my recruiter when I was trying to negotiate. So, it has everything that I just mentioned. I thank them for their time. I tell them that I have a competing offer and that I would like to negotiate something comparable to that. If they can get close to the number that I have in mind, I'll be ready to sign the contract immediately. But yeah, that is the end of my workshop. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them up in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask. Otherwise, if you're not comfortable right now, you can email me afterwards, or you can reach out to me on LinkedIn for anything, honestly. If you just want to have a chat, if you have questions about just tech in general, if you want to practice mock interviews or even want feedback on your resume, completely up to you. But yeah. No problem. Okay. Take care and thank you for having me. Bye.